Welcome everyone to this session of this wonderful conference sponsored by the Polin Museum. But it's wonderful that because of this technology, we can come together from all over the world. So we just need a little patience for the occasional technical problem. But it's a wonderful opportunity to gather virtually with scholars from all over. I'm Cecile Kuznets. I teach at Bard College in New York, which is where I am right now. And I'm very excited and honored, really, to participate and to be chairing this panel entitled Reconsidering the Spatial Turn in Jewish Studies, a Relational Approach. And we have two speakers today. I just want to note that one of our speakers that was originally on the program, Professor Klaus Hödl, is unable to join us, unfortunately. So we have two wonderful papers that we're very excited about, but we may, well, actually, it's a good thing because we'll have a little extra time to focus on these two wonderful presentations. So I will introduce our first speaker, who will then present, then we'll have the second speaker. And I just want to remind you that anyone listening can type in questions into the chat for either speaker. You don't have to wait till the end, as they occur to you, and I will monitor the questions and collect them at the end for our discussion. Okay, so feel free to use the chat as questions occur to you. So our first speaker today is Susanne Korbel, who's is a researcher and lecturer at the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Graz, where she also earned her doctoral degree. She's published a book just in 2021, and I will attempt not to completely butcher the title in German, but with my apologies for my pronunciation. Her book is entitled Auf die Tour, Jüdinnen und Juden in Singspielhalle, Kabarett und Varieté zwischen Habsburger Monarchie und Amerika 1900. No idea how I did on that, but hopefully you got the gist. That sounds like a fascinating topic. Professor Korbel has held fellowships in Jerusalem, New York, Southampton, and Tübingen, and is taught in Budapest and in Haifa. And she's currently working on a project on narratives of the history of Jews in Vienna around 1900, based on everyday life encounters. And the title of her presentation today is A Jewish Urban Space, ? Non-Jews in Vienna's Leopoldstadt. So I'll now turn it over to our first speaker.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, and thank you for the organizers for having me. I will just start my presentation in a second and then go directly into my paper. Good. In this presentation, I question the exclusivity of Jewish districts. I wish to do so by analyzing a neighborhood in Vienna's Leopoldstadt, a Jewish quarter par excellence. According to the dominant narrative in the Habsburg and later Austrian capital, which hosted Europe's second largest Jewish community in the first decades of the 20th century, Jews lived predominantly, almost exclusively, in this neighborhood, and Jews not only lived there, but also lived there separated from non-Jews. I quote, "The Vienna Jews lived with other Jews. The creation of Jewish neighborhoods in the city served to separate Jews from Gentiles and install more deeply the perception that Jews formed a distinct group. Within their neighborhoods, Jews came into contact chiefly with other Jews. Their residential concentration thus hindered them from forming friendships and other intimate relationships with non-Jews." Unquote. Yet, these days, there are a bulk of new sources and digital methods available, and in the course of my research, I found that this was not the case. I argue that Vienna and other modern metropolises alike provided their Jewish and non-Jewish inhabitants with numerous opportunities to face encounters, not only in public, but also in private spaces. I thus scrutinize the presumed exclusivity of Jewish districts by examining a residential building located in the Leopoldstadt. Using a microhistorical approach, I reconstruct The building reconstruct encounters that came about in the course of daily life at Glockenstraße 29. Analyzing a variety of sources, I demonstrate that microhistory can be productively combined with spatial considerations to gain new insights into Jewish-non-Jewish relations in private and public spaces. I wish to begin my presentation with an example of how a housing was portrayed as a space for Jewish and non-Jewish relations in a memoir. Entitled Glockengasse 29, Wilma Neuwirth, who was born Wilma Kühnberg in Vienna in 1928, recounts her childhood in Leopoldstadt in the 1920s and 1930s. At various points, Wilma Neuwirth emphasizes that there was intensive contact among the residents of the apartment house with good neighborly relations and many friendships. We had such a warm atmosphere in the corridor that everyone knew everything about each other. In summer, when it was extremely hot, it became especially cozy. The women appeared in the gangway with a bucket or bowl and an armchair. They filled their respective vessels with water and sat down, having their feet in the cool water in front of the windows belonging to their apartments. Everyone had their coffee mug with Psychoriencafé. They would sit there for hours, gossiping and joking, unquote. According to Neuwirth's memoirs, most of the families lived not so much in their flats, but rather in the whole building. I quote again, Mr. and Mrs. Högenwart, who were my father's customers, also lived on our floor. We had a particularly good neighborly relationship with them. The doors of the apartments were not locked. You came and went to your neighbors as you pleased. Unquote. At the turn of the 20th century, Vienna's second district Leopoldstadt was known as the Jewish quarter far beyond the city's borders. It was home not only to the Northern Railway Station, which connected the capital of the Habsburg Empire with its easternmost provinces, and was thus the first port of call for Jewish migrants from Eastern Europe, but also home to many synagogues and Jewish institutions. It was this, having been the historical settlement area of the Jewish community in early modern times, plus the fact that at the turn of the 20th century many Jews continued to live in the area, that earned the district the name Matzeinsel. By no means, however, were Jews the only ones living in the Leopoldstadt. Counting around 3,000 houses, the district was the most densely populated part of the city for both Jews and non-Jews. In apartment buildings, people shared sanitary facilities and usually also the dormitories, because bed lodgers were widespread in Vienna. Jews and non-Jews regularly met in the streets. In the neighboring parks, leisure time was spent side by side. I would like to briefly point out at this point that also people in better off households by no means lived exclusively with family members, and that it was common for the middle and upper classes to employ domestic servants who would then live with the families they were employed by. But in this presentation, I will not focus on this kind of encounters taking place in private spaces. Here we go into the Leopoldstadt, and here we have the historic map of the 1920s. Here we go. The apartment building in which Wilma Neuwirth grew up was located in the very heart of this district, just 2 blocks away from the southeast end of the Augarten, a large public area, and 5-minute walk to the Prater, the place where people spend their leisure time. The Kühnberg family lived in a neighborhood full of shops, coffee houses, theaters, as well as religious sites. Just across the block, the Davorstraße, one of the city's most famous vaudeville areas, was located. Also, the Leopoldstädter Temple, the largest synagogue of Vienna, was only a 10-minute walk away. Many Catholic churches and smaller Jewish Bethhäuser, prayer rooms, were found on or across the street. And literally, just a few doors down the block, there was the famous Varieté Réclame, a cinema and vaudeville that hosted the most popular performances of the time. It was there at Glockenstraße 29 that Wilma Kümberg grew up in a Jewish Catholic family. Her father had immigrated to Vienna from Budapest and before from Galicia, with 3 children from his first marriage. It was there that he and Wilma's mother, who had immigrated to Vienna as a domestic worker from a rural area in Lower Austria, met. Only a few years later, the working-class couple had 8 children to care for. Wilma's father, Josef Kümberg, was a hairdresser with his own business, and her mother, Maria Kümberg, born Böhm, took care of the 8 children and of her parents-in-law. But how did the family of Den live there? Wilma's family settled in a typical Zimmer-Küche-Kabinett apartment. Wilma, her 7 siblings, her mother and her father all lived there. This means that the family of Den shared an apartment of approximately 50 square meters, which included 2 toilet areas with no running water separated within these rooms. And still, this was a more comfortable living situation than the previous generation had been exposed to. Since a massive growth of its population transformed Vienna into a metropolis of more than 2 million inhabitants, the vast majority of people had to share housing with their fellow citizens at the turn of the century. This led as much as 20% of the population ending up as so-called Bettgeher, bed lodgers, people who could not even afford to rent a shared room and had to pay for a bed only to sleep in. This means that up until the 1930s, 1/5 of Vienna's inhabitants shared allegedly most intimate atmosphere of a home with an average of 6 up to 10 other non-family members. Accordingly, there existed plenty of opportunities for Jewish and non-Jewish relations to emerge in private spaces. The building at Glockengasse 29 had 3 floors. On the ground floor, was Wilma's father's hairdressing salon and a grocery. On the 1st and 2nd floors, there were 5 residential units each. Under the roof on the 3rd floor, there were 2 residential units. The apartments were oriented to the streets and to the courtyard. The corridor was arbor-like and led outside to the entrances of the apartments. Who were the residents of Glockengasse 29? Starting from the memoir of Wilma Kümberg, I have included other sources to reconstruct who the inhabitants of the house were and at the time when the Kümberg family lived there. The grocery next to Father Kümberg's saloon was run by the Bergkirchner family. On the 1st floor, the Wanetscheks and the Häuslers, a non-Jewish and a Jewish family, had their apartments. In addition, there were 3 more apartments. On the 2nd floor, this is where the Kümbergs lived, resided Mr. and Mrs. Högenwart, the von Otten family, and a coffee house owner named Mrs. Kemper. As Neuwirth wrote in her memoir, I quote, "There were 5 apartments on the 2nd floor. Beside us, 2 other Jewish and 2 Catholic families lived there. Under the roof, David Hirsch and his wife and a non-Jewish family had their apartments." I suggest approaching the housing spaces as shared spaces. The research group of the New York Tenement Museum stated that focusing especially on encounters between neighbors is most important when it came to interactions, getting acquainted with living conditions and forming relationships. Because, as they learned from testimonies, staircases, entrance areas, but also rooms within inner flats were open to the other inhabitants of a building, and the spaces surrounding the inhabitants' living rooms functioned as contact zones and zones of active engagement with their fellow inhabitants. Notions of shared spaces are common in the memoirs of Vienna's Jewish population as well. In addition, their memoirs reveal that they paid particular attention to these contact zones in or near their homes. A second important aspect of daily encounters between Jews and non-Jews in the private sphere is that they seem to have been less characterized by antisemitism in a first instance. Within their private spaces, most people were indifferent to antisemitism. Klaus Hödel, our third panelist who cannot be here with us today, found evidence that Jewishness did not matter when deciding whether or not a person would be allowed to rent a bed, for example. Instead, people tended to draw attention to former experiences, relationships, and meaningful contacts which they shared with applicants. In the context of everyday life, people acted with indifference towards their peers. Individual activities suggest that behavior necessary for daily routines or to earn a living may have diverged in some cases from the articulation of debates that shaped public opinion. So, what was life like outside the Glockengasse 29? And which places and spaces did the Kühnbergs frequented regularly in the course of everyday life? Wilma Kühnberg remembers that she lived almost in the streets. Quote, "For us, the Prater Hauptallee was actually our extended kids' room." Unquote. They would all go shopping in the nearby Karmelitermarkt. She and her sister often followed their elderly brothers to play soccer at the Konstantinhügel in the Prater, and they went to school a few meters down to Blumauergasse. In the afternoons, she, her sister, and up to 12 other Jewish and non-Jewish children from the same street would play outside. Quote, "We were a group of 12 to 15 ragamuffin who had nothing else on their minds but to cook up new pranks all the time." Unquote. This praxis of frequent movement outside one's home inevitably involved meeting other people. For the children, sometimes this ended well, while at other times it ended with getting into trouble, depending on how the pranks were perceived. In any case, the everyday life of adults and children did not take place in isolation. Yet, moving a few years forward in Wilma Kühnberg's autobiography, less idyllic memoirs are revealed. As in many other autobiographies that report on life in the interwar period, it very quickly becomes apparent what drastic changes the seizure of power by the National Socialists brought to Jewish and non-Jewish relations, which until then had been perceived as continuous and thoroughly positive. Concerning the very next-door neighbors of the Kühnberg, Wilma Kühnberg wrote in her memoir, I quote again, "Mr. and Mrs. Högenwart, with whom we had lived together in best harmony for years, became mortal enemies overnight in 1938. Or, the Wanitscheks also made our lives hell during the Hitler years." And concerning her friends, "Our friends, whom we had known since we were little children and with whom we were together every day, insulted us in the meanest way." This finding concerning the transformation of Jewish and non-Jewish relations under National Socialism is, of course, not a new one. Why then should the spatial homogeneity of Jewish neighborhoods be questioned at all? First, I argue it demonstrates that conventional interpretations of anti-Semitism are somewhat outdated and need to be expanded. In studies of the process of Jews acquiring bourgeois equality, it has been highlighted that it was the exclusion of Jewish population from associations from the turn of the century onward that nourished the increasing radicalization of anti-Semitism in the first decades of the 20th century, since it resulted in less contact between Jews and non-Jews. Looking at the housing conditions of the working class or the bed lodgers who were plagued by even greater poverty, however, a narrative of isolation, either for Jewish or non-Jewish neighborhoods, cannot be sustained. A narrative that goes beyond dichotomous explanations can help expand this line of reasoning by questioning the presumption of exclusivity through the perspective of space as a shared space. It is important to ask how it could be that such frequent and positive exchanges did not lead to lasting relationships, and how exclusion mechanisms were implemented so radically within a very short time. Hence, and secondly, an in-depth spatial analysis of Jewish and non-Jewish relations reveal new points of departure for the study of contexts and relations between Jews and non-Jews. Studies interested in space can thus expand our binary narratives that are predominantly until now. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. That was really wonderful. And I'm pleased now to introduce our second speaker, Maya Holtman. She is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for European Research at the University of Gothenburg. And she also holds a research fellowship at the Center for Business History in Stockholm. She received her PhD from the University of Southampton, and she's the author of a forthcoming book that explores the intersection of the history of emotions, digital humanities, and Jewish history through the case study of modern Stockholm. And she'll also be focusing on Stockholm today in her talk, which is entitled Reconstructing the Swedish Ostjude, Deep Mapping, GIS, and Urban Space.
Thank you so much, Cecile. Thank you, Susanne. I've written down so many notes, but before we get into discussing it, obviously I need to present, and I hope you can see the screen right now. And as you will see straight away, I have removed the deep mapping approach. And for all of you who were here for that sole reason, I'm very sorry. You have to contact me afterwards so we can discuss more about it. So I originally planned to investigate the combined role then of a digital GIS approach and then the digital methodology of deep mapping as a way to understand Jewish and non-Jewish relations in the case study that I'm looking at, which is modern Stockholm. But I will instead still show how the quantitative methodology of the digital tool ArcGIS can inform on spatial relations between the Protestant majority and the Jewish minority in the Swedish capital. I have decided to instead combine it with textual and visual evidence that provide insights and problematizes the contemporary construction and, until today, the lingering image of the Ostjude. These perspectives can be added to and analytically developed in deep mapping later on, but due to time constraints, I haven't not yet arrived there, and which is why I'm not presenting on it. But having excused myself, I'll now move on to the rest of the paper. So in this paper, I suggest that the methodology of digital mapping, on the surface really consisting of hard facts, can be used to understand the complex human experience of coexisting as a religious and ethnic minority in the predominantly Protestant Swedish capital on the northern fringes of Europe. I just need to change slide. The other day, I was looking for a city walk in Stockholm to attend with my father, and I scrolled through the websites of city walks given by Stockholm's City Museum, and I came across this very walk, which is labeled as Northern Jews and Southern Jews, Södermalm, which is a district in southern Stockholm. The information for this heritage walk even starts off by describing, quote, the Jewish population in Stockholm as divided into two groups far into the 1930s, end of quote. And it explains this division to be geographically enhanced. The idea is that the Jewish population during the 19th and 20th centuries were divided into two groups. You can see now a map of Stockholm, and in the south, in the lower circle, the circle to the bottom, it was supposed that the Jews who settled there were Eastern European, poor and Orthodox, while the Jews who settled in the northeastern part, the upper circle, were defined as integrated, rich and reform. Newspaper articles written by both Jews and non-Jews at this time, meaning the beginning of the 20th century, often mentioned the so-called Eastern European invention and described existing clusters of Eastern European Jews on this southern island. The very same outline has indeed been reproduced without really any research going into the topographical settlements of Stockholm's Jews in most scholarly work published from the 1920s up until today. But contradictory to these historical, contemporary, and historiographical discourses, the maps of Jewish topographical relations that I have produced with the digital ArcGIS tool portray a rather different understanding of the Eastern European Jewish relationship with Stockholm's urban landscape. So what we are looking at here is the residential distribution of the Mosaic congregation's taxed members in 1935 in relation to their economic capabilities. The Mosaic congregation was the Jewish community's umbrella organization. It was the official mouthpiece towards the non-Jewish society, and it was rather exclusively aligned to Reform Judaism. It had a membership fee for everyone who wanted to be a part of the Mosaic congregation, and this membership fee was proportionally determined by each member's income. So therefore, what you're looking at is basically an analysis of this fee, which then shows us the economic dimension of urban relationships. So to the bottom left here, you can basically see how much Jewish individuals paid in fees in Swedish kroner at the time to the Mosaic congregation. As can be observed in this map, residences belonging to members who paid between 0 and 100 Swedish kroner were located across the whole city, and they amounted to about 68% of the whole Jewish population, so the clear majority. Apartments for working classes clearly existed in all districts, making no urban space impenetrable for the lower classes. And in this sense, the economic standing did not automatically lead to topographical segregation. On the other hand, the Mosaic congregation's wealthiest members did not set up homes in any urban district. The residences belonging to these Jews were instead located mainly in the modern northeastern area of Stockholm, but also along waterfront promenades connected to the main water bodies. Some also lived on the southern island and the island to the west in areas where they would have a view of the capital's natural features and urban skyline. So consequently, if members of the Mosaic congregation could afford it, they would establish homes in urban districts that allowed for an immersion into the modern or uniquely natural environment of Stockholm. But what was the distribution of residences belonging to the Ostjorden, these so-called Eastern European poor and Orthodox Jews who are supposed to live on the southern island at this time? To answer this question, I have looked at members of the Orthodox, traditional, or conservative synagogue Adas Yisrael. It basically uses all these labels to explain itself, so I'm using all the labels as well. And these members in Adas Yisrael, did they differ that much from members of the Mosaic congregation? Were they mainly poor and Eastern European? And did they cluster on the southern island? If we move to the map that shows these members of Adas Yisrael, the Orthodox community or traditional community, we can see that although we have a lot less people, we still have a sort of similar pattern in how they actually put up their residences in Stockholm. Curiously, members of Adas Yisrael were oftentimes also members of the Mosaic congregation. So although the Mosaic congregation was mainly run by established and Reform Jews at the beginning of the 20th century and was decidedly linked to Reform Judaism, its membership was also the only way for an individual to gain a social status within the Jewish community as a whole. So the social status of the membership seemingly encouraged traditional practitioners to join, and in this way they were actually connected to two religious places with two different religious affiliations. So therefore, although being a numerously much smaller group, the links between the Mosaic congregation and traditional practitioners were many. As we can see here, Adass Yisrael's wealthiest members also lived in the modern northeastern area of Stockholm. The members who were untaxed by the Mosaic congregation, however, lived in the southern area. And there could be many reasons why someone would be untaxed by the Mosaic congregation. One thing could be that they did not have a Swedish citizenship, and therefore they were not even allowed to have a membership in the Mosaic congregation. Another thing could be that they could not afford to pay the membership fee, therefore they were not included, and therefore they were not taxed. And another thing could also be that they decided to not be a part of the Mosaic congregation because they did not want to be affiliated with Reform Judaism. So the group that are untaxed, we don't really know if they were actually poorer. They could have other reasons for choosing to not be a part of the Mosaic congregation. What I find really interesting is also if we look at this pattern then connected to the synagogue, which is the red big circle in the middle really of the picture. For many of the members of Adass Yisrael, it would take them between 45 minutes to walk to this synagogue. And many of them did that every morning and every evening, as well as on Shabbat, of course. So it seems like the residential distribution of traditional practitioners essentially mirrors the patterns of the members of the Mosaic congregation, showing that neither class nor the location of religious institutions were large influences on the membership of this specific shul. Instead, both Reform and traditional Jews adopted the same relationship to the city, and they settled in more modern and developed areas if economic means allowed for it. So the mappings produced by ArcGIS suggest that there were few economic and topographical differences between Orthodox Jews, the so-called Ostjuden, and Reformed Jews. Both groups instead seemed rather in tune with Stockholm's urban identity and related to Stockholm's topography and districts, much like any Stockholmer would. These maps provide a new framework for understanding Jewish life in Stockholm. It denounces a divided population according to class, religion, and geography, and instead emphasizes an integrational approach to Stockholm's larger society. With these mappings in mind, the follow-up question for me at least is naturally, so where does the imagination of this Ostjude, of this Eastern European, poor and Orthodox Jew living on the southern island, where does this come from? During internal discussions and conflicts on the Mosaic congregation's provision of economic scholarships towards different religious sites, such as afternoon schools, mikvot, minyanim, leaders of both the Mosaic congregation and Adass Yisrael both used antagonistic tropes against each other to underline their own argument. So the Ostjude was one of these frequently used tropes, and it even wandered beyond the borders of the Jewish world. During a visit to Adass Yisrael in 1905, a journalist and member of the Mosaic congregation described Adass Yisrael's members in the following way. So the members of Adass Yisrael read the prayer with fierce waddles and bow their backs towards the congregation. They turn around, and now I see these two shapeless figures with head and a bigger part of the body covered by the white-blue striped shawl, and I feel closer to the Orient when they slowly, murmuring, waddle back and fro. There is something mystic, something ancient about it all. In this passage, the author, who again was a member of the Mosaic congregation, sort of ridicules and exotifies at least the members of Adass Yisrael, and he goes on to position them in opposition to the members of the Mosaic congregation, who he describes as, quote, acclimatized and sophisticated, end of quote. And this article was published in a daily newspaper that was read by all non-Jews who could afford it across all of Stockholm. So while imaginations of Ostjuden thus existed within both the Jewish community and the larger non-Jewish society, with this new framework in mind, referring back to the mappings, what were the relations between non-Jews and these so-called Ostjuden-like in Sweden's capital? To answer this, I will lastly analyze visual sources of Adass Yisrael's first venue, which was located in a pietist girl orphanage from 1871 onwards. This orphanage had been created in 1747, and it was one of 16 institutions for orphaned or destitute children in Stockholm at the turn of the 20th century. With its unique religious stance, the orphanage provided accommodation and school for some 20 orphaned girls born in legal marriages, and it trained them to become domestic servants, providing courses on handicrafts such as sewing, weaving, and cooking. The first and second floors of the orphanage building were renovated in 1859, and the architectural designs, as you can see in this picture, sort of reveal the orphanage's practical needs. We have on the top floor, which is also the top design that you can see, the sleeping areas of 2 big rooms with tile stoves, and in the bottom, the first floor, which is the bottom design, we have the big circle, which shows a school venue. And this is the part of the building that I want to focus on. This school venue had 6 windows, 3 towards the south and 3 towards the north. So it ensured that the presence of daylight was always there, physically aiding educational activities. The emphasis on daylight, however, also symbolized the orphanage's goal in transforming the girls into pious workers. Indeed, even the staircase was provided with windows on each floor, guaranteeing that no activities were executed in the dark. And you can see the staircase here on both designs. It's the gray area. The windows in this staircase were of particular importance due to the central role of the staircase. It did not only transport employees and girls from one floor to another, but it also connected all the different venues. The landing on first floor, which is a bottom design, had 3 doors connected to offices, the school venue, and the hallway. While not warmed up by stoves, and thus not soliciting longer stays, it connected people in movement before diverting them into different activities in different rooms. The building's design, which linked all the rooms then to this sole staircase, becomes particularly important when trying to understand venue's function in expediting Jewish, non-Jewish relations. The Orthodox group rented the school venue to the right in the bottom design on the first floor, and it basically shared the same building, the same front door, and the same staircase as the girls in the Pietist orphanage until the latter relocated in 1899. The everyday Orthodox rituals taking place in the synagogue every morning and every evening they took place every morning and every evening, meaning that the group visited the building at least once, if not twice a day. Although leaving the street behind them, the entry hall would not shut out the public street life. As this photograph of the vestibule shows, The building's entrance was flooded with light during the day. So in the bottom left, you can see the door out towards the street. And you can see the window in the staircase that I was talking about to the left as well. The white walls accentuated this sense, and the gas lamp, which you can see up to the right, illuminated the room during evenings. With orphan girls walking to the nearby school and then coming back and naturally being home in the evening, they would most certainly have met the Orthodox practitioners in this very staircase. Perhaps they even heard prayers and conversations through the doors. Located in such close vicinity to the non-Jewish world, literally just a wooden door away, the journey through the building into the Orthodox community's venue would have emphasized the synagogue's belonging to the Swedish society. In the same article that I quoted earlier, written by a member of the Mosaic congregation, this Jewish journalist noted children in the hallway and how they, quote, ran out of and into the venue, end of quote, throughout the whole Shabbat service. And by saying this, he's implying that they felt at home in this house and then by extension in this part of Stockholm. So clearly, members of Adas Yisrael, many of them from Eastern Europe, positioned themselves in the immediate vicinity of Swedish Christian life. And although we have no textual sources that reveal the nature of the relationship between the pietist orphanage's leaders or the girls who lived there and the practitioners of Adas Yisrael, we can deduce that there must have been frequent, if not daily, encounters in this very staircase. Spatially, the Ostjuden in Stockholm were not reclusive and they did not cluster. 30 years after sharing this building with the pietist orphanage, they were instead, as I showed in the mappings earlier, indeed engaged in the general Jewish strategy of topographical integration. This spatial approach, based on an analysis from digital tools and visual sources, reveals the everyday, matter-of-fact relations between Ostjuden and non-Jews in Sweden's capital. Contrary to the reclusive, exotic, and clustering trope provided by contemporary sources, historiographical statements, and the city walk that will be given in a few weeks, Eastern European Jews mingled, interacted, and participated in urban life. Created from anti-Semitic and internal power relations, the trope of the Ostjude had very little to do with urban reality. By including quantitative studies through digital mapping, as well as visual sources, I argue that the spatial approach is pivotal for understanding the lived experience of the Jewish minority, and indeed the religious minorities within that Jewish minority. It does not only reveal mundane relational spaces between Jews and non-Jews, but it can also allow insight into internal power relations and the construction, mobilization, and migration of spatial imaginations, of which some might still affect our historical memory of Jewish life today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very rich presentation. I'll remind those listening and watching to feel free to write questions into the chat. I see we've already have a few. So right now I'm going to speak for a few minutes with a few comments and questions, which I'll then give our speakers the chance to respond to, and then we'll turn to the chat and take questions and comments that people have written in. So I think, it's obvious that these two papers fit very well together and that they both look at similar themes that question the idea of isolation, Jewish isolation, on two different levels, both the isolation of Jews from non-Jews within these cities and the isolation of different types of Jews, the so-called native or Jewish residents of long standing versus the newcomers, the recent immigrants who were the so-called Ostjuden. And I think that both of these papers illustrate very well the the value of paying very close attention to urban space and to architecture on various scales, ranging from a real microhistory of individual buildings to the neighborhood scale to the scale of the city as a whole, but always in these presentations with very careful readings of those topographical and architectural sources, but also alongside that, combining those kinds of tools, looking at maps, plans, etc., with more traditional textual sources like the press and memoirs. So I think bringing these different kinds of sources together gives us a very rich picture. In Dr. Hultman's paper, she makes the very astute linkage between kind of the sort of metaphor, the kind of spatial metaphor of uptown versus downtown Jews, which also has been used in relation to New York, right? The uptown Jews being the wealthier, reformed Jews of German origin, and the downtown Jews being the more recent, poorer, more traditional East European immigrants, and how that kind of metaphor is actually not just a metaphor, but relates to the urban landscape, but then calls that into question, right? So to what extent is this longstanding kind of trope actually rooted in historical reality? And then Dr. Korbel's paper, by talking about these relations into the period of Nazi rule, I think really highlights some of the larger issues and implications that are at stake in using this as a venue for looking at Jewish, non-Jewish relations. So a couple of other common points that struck me is that both of these presentations really show the importance of liminal spaces as sites of interaction. So in Dr. Hultman's paper, we have the hallways of the orphanage that as a site of interaction between the Protestants and Jews. In Dr. Korbel's paper, we have a description of the hallways and corridors of these living spaces, these apartment buildings, as sites of interaction, as well as outdoor spaces, right, the street and so forth. And that made me think about what other types of spaces might also serve those kinds of functions. There was in the paper on Vienna, one short reference to the courtyards of the buildings. And that made me think of the famous courtyards of large apartment buildings in Warsaw as sites of communal activity. And, to what role courtyards might play, or what other kinds of spaces we might think about as being particularly significant for these kinds of interactions. Both of these papers also show that even though the longstanding stereotypes might be simplistic and not backed up by historical data, that there were significant patterns of residential segregation. So I think one larger question that they raised for me is what types of divisions, are most salient and which ones are just too simplistic or not backed up by historical evidence. So in the case of the traditional synagogue, right, we saw that there were some wealthier Jews who did belong to the traditional synagogue. So I was curious who those people might be. Are those longtime residents who were just more conservative in their religious practice? Were they recent immigrants who managed to reach a higher economic status? And more broadly, if another set of categories that seem to be called into question here, are traditional versus integrated, right? To what extent do those map onto the categories of native versus immigrant Jews? Are those are the equivalence between those two sets of categories something else we should be questioning? On the other hand, in the case of Vienna, Dr. Korbel seemed to be making the case that there was more mixing of Jewish and non-Jewish population among the working class, that working class residents of Leopoldstadt included both Jews and non-Jews. And we know that because of the crowded conditions in working class neighborhoods, there tends to be more life lived out in public and less conformity to the bourgeois ideal of focusing on the domestic space, right? It's just not feasible. So how important is class as a division, middle class or upper class versus working class? After all, we do see that this example of Leopoldstadt, of the working class of different faiths living closely together. Is there more intermixing among the lower class than among the more affluent? We see that in Stockholm, despite all of the sort of nuance that Dr. Hultman introduced, that the northern residents tended to be wealthier than the southern residents, right? So the larger question is, what role does class really play in figuring into these categories? And finally, these papers made me think about what other spatial patterns might be productive to think about if we are calling into question the model of uptown versus downtown. We have in Stockholm perhaps a different kind of model where wealthier residents cluster along the waterfront, right? So is there a pattern where there are certain neighborhoods in some cities with more desirable natural features like parks or waterways, right, that become distinctive, right? On the other hand, if we think about the Chicago School of Sociology, right, with its model of working class being in the urban core, and then wealthier neighborhoods, middle class and wealthier neighborhoods being in concentric rings, right? Is that a useful spatial pattern to think about applying to other cities? I myself have talked a little about a similar kind of concentric pattern in the case of Vilnius. So I'm just wondering if we're going to call into question uptown, downtown, is there another kind of metaphor or model that would apply in these particular cases, or more broadly in other urban case studies? So I'll leave it at that in terms of my comments. And I see we have questions in the chat, but before we turn to them, I'll give our speakers a chance to respond if they wish to now.
May I start?
Yes, so please.
Okay. Thank you for your rich comments, actually, and your thoughts. I think, yes, I will take up your thought on the liminal spaces first. I think what is very thrilling is that actually in a lot of memoirs, this kind of not really belonging to the very inner part of a home, if you call it home, but the transmitting spaces outside or close to the homes have this character of liminality somewhat. But if you look closer into what people write about who entered their homes, for example, it becomes also evident that the entrance itself and also the hall or the living room could become a liminal space itself. And for the Vienna case, in my project, I was taking out different apartment building in different parts of the cities. And it always is, of course, a question of the architecture of each building. For sure, the courtyards, but very often for the children, the whole street and the whole block and the close surrounding nearby function as a kind of liminal encounter space, if you would call it like that, or the shops in the ground floor, which had a kind of same character because you go there out of a special necessity, but also go there just to chat or to encounter who work there or who also frequently goes there. Yes, and for sure, thank you for your comment on, or your question on the importance of class division. It is obvious that class is very important, and I try to also point at the phenomenon of shared living spaces among the bourgeoisie with the domestic workers, which is of course a bit different, but still existed also for the upper and middle classes. Yes, but I think the working class and the poorer population is especially interesting when it comes to looking at shared living spaces, or if you want to question if private encounters between Jews and non-Jews took place, whatever private then is defined of and or mean. Yes. And concerning the spatial patterns, sorry, did I interrupt you?
No.
No, okay, I just heard. I think that in the end, it is, or for me, it was very important not just to look at a allegedly typical living area of Jews, but really look at the whole city and at different places in the whole city, and took apartment buildings out of the different districts in the city to question if there were patterns predominantly or not. And I'm not finished with the project yet, so I'm up to this and will keep it in mind. Thank you for the question.
Yes, thank you so much, Cecile. I'm really happy you picked up on all these similarities between my paper and Susanna's paper, which I was also really happy about because we didn't really talk about it beforehand. So that was lovely, really. Yeah, the question about the richer Jews who belong to the Orthodox community, and I think I would like to marry this question together with, like you say, how do we understand the relationship between traditional Jews and integrated Jews, which I think really links into this question. So yes, Israel, the Orthodox community, did have some Jews. I think it was a third of them, if I remember my numbers correct, that had a good income, a really good income that they could live on. It wasn't just trying to survive day by day, but they had a social status from their employment, from their social position, which is really interesting that here we do have a sort of Orthodox community made up with all these rich people who then prefer to live in the modern and the northeastern area of Stockholm and walk all this way down to this specific synagogue. I find it really fascinating. It really calls to mind. I mean, they were both traditional and integrated, then socially integrated, economically integrated at the same time. And one example would be the chairman, who was called Jacob Ettlinger, and he was a chairman from the beginning of the 1920s up until his death in 1952. And he had a membership in the Mosaic congregation as well, like so many others did. He was one of the richest people within the Mosaic congregation as a whole, yet he kept being faithful towards this Orthodox community. And regarding the question of where did they come from and what was the background, he came from Germany, had immigrated to Sweden in 1917, and most of the members of the Orthodox community are also have been born outside of Sweden. But even though they socially advance or socially integrate, they still keep their religious affiliation. It changes generationally. I've done only a small study on this to see, but normally people in the next generation don't stay. So that was unfortunate for them, but that's what it looks like at least. And class as a division, I see, thank you for picking up on that. I see class as a main division within at least the Jewish community in Stockholm. Partly, as I presented, religion did divide people, but in a way it did not, because people still wanted to have a membership in the Mosaic congregation, influence what kind of religious institutions that were given money within the whole Jewish community. So in that sense, religion wasn't the dividing factor. And also within the Orthodox community itself, I mean, I showed one synagogue. There were lots of other prayer houses consisting of people who were not as rich as the members in Adass Israel, and they felt very unwelcomed in Adass Israel, this Orthodox community that I showed to you, which means that they would set up their smaller prayer houses somewhere else in the city and not necessarily close to them, but they would basically, within the Orthodox community, we see class divisions going on, and that seems to be the main dividing factor and source of irritation within the Jewish community at this time. And your question about spatial patterns and if we need to find new models for understanding how Jews settled in Stockholm, Vienna, and many other cities. I find this really fascinating. I need to think about this so much more. But I think there's something, like you say, about wanting to be close to nature, wanting to perhaps have a nice view, perhaps of the urban skyline, to get a sense of what kind of city they're in, and relate their identity to the city in that sense. And it would be really interesting, perhaps, to compare different cities and different topographical residential patterns across different cities to see, like you say, if we can actually find new models that explain to us how Jews integrated into the urban landscape. So thank you so much, Cecile.
Well, thank you. Thanks to both of you. So we have a number of questions here in the chat, so I'll go through them in the order they came in. The first two are specifically to Maya, so I think I'll sort of read those both, and then you can respond, and then we have some others. So the first question, I guess I could just read it here. How do you know that the members of the synagogue actually walk there every day? Might they have prayed daily in a smaller local minyan and then only frequented Adas Israel on holidays or once a week on the Sabbath? So you already just mentioned other local synagogues, so that kind of ties in to there. And then I'll just also, since it's directed to you, the second question, is about the time frame of your research. Could you perhaps say something on how the situation changed after the Second World War, following the high number of refugees and Holocaust survivors, mostly of East European origin, who reached Stockholm?
Yeah, thank you so much for these questions. Regarding the first question about if we do know that they walk there every day, I know that some members did so, at least in the 1920s, when they write a report to the Mosaic congregation and argue that we need more money to be able to continue to exist. They do have a problem forming a minyan in the morning and in the evening. So there's a problem actually gathering 10 people. But the synagogue is more than full. Over 200 people visit during the high holidays. So you're completely right that we don't have 200 people gathering every morning and every evening, but we do have people that walked to the synagogue and tried to make sure that there was a minyan for the morning and evening prayers. The second question, unfortunately, I do stop the topographical analysis in 1939 due to many reasons. And the biggest reason is that that form of information is not made public in the Swedish archives, because it is viewed as being, if it's less than, what is this, 80 years or 70 years, something like that, it's viewed as being invasive of personal privacy. So I can't really find addresses and make this kind of analysis for the time after the Second World War, which is a big shame. But I guess in 20 years that will be possible when the time has passed.
Okay, thank you. So I think, so let's see, we have two questions from Scott Ori. One is specific to Stockholm, and then there's a second question that's also specific to Stockholm. So I think I'll combine those two, and then I'll come back to the broader question that applies to both speakers. So for Susanna, so regarding Stockholm, to what extent was the discourse regarding the Ostjuden influenced by similar discussions in larger urban centers, from Berlin to Vienna and from London to New York? Okay, so putting it in that larger comparative context. And then I'll also read now a second question that relates specifically to the Stockholm case. You mentioned that the main family that you discussed was described as interreligious, Catholic, Jewish. So I also wondered exactly what that meant, and why, if so, why did you choose to focus on this specific family?
Right, so I start with the first question. I haven't actually really looked through every publication that mentions Ostjorden in Stockholm at this time, because I've been mainly focusing on other things in the project. But yes, I assume, and from the few, not the few, but from the papers or the newspaper articles that I have seen, they are always referring back to the Ostjorden in different cities from the places that are mentioned in your question: Berlin, Vienna, London, New York, etc. So there's a clear understanding that this is going on in other places, and now it's coming to Sweden as well. And we need to, well, in their narrative, we need to make sure that, you know, try to keep these Eastern European Jews off Swedish soil, really. I should also clarify that, I mean, I'm talking to you now about Ostjorden, but that wasn't really how it was talked about within the Jewish community, at least at the time. They were rather called, like I said at the beginning, Southern Jews, Söderjudar. So very much located in the Swedish topography and not within this larger geographical scale that you asked about. But thank you for pointing me towards that direction in future projects.
Okay. And Suzanne, could you speak about the family that you chose to focus on in your microhistory? Yeah.
Yes, so basically what I do in the project is that I took out apartment buildings in different districts, as I mentioned already, and I start with those buildings. I get a lot of information from a memoir, of course, because we have in Vienna at the time a population of almost 2 million people, and working through the address book is impossible. So we need digital methods and text tracing, etc., and I need a good starting point. And I particularly was thrilled by the way Wilma Neuwirth narrates and remembers her history in Vienna's Leopoldstadt. And this was one of the initial reasons why I took it. And in her specific case, she is the daughter to both immigrants. One mother who was an immigrant as a domestic worker. This was a very, very common immigration pattern for women at the time to Vienna. And the father was born in Tarnów and immigrated to Budapest and later to Vienna. And she experienced growing up in a Jewish Catholic family as particularly difficult because under National Socialism, she was a child of a so-called Mischehe, and beforehand her Jewish grandparents didn't like her non-Jewish daughter-in-law and so on and so forth. And she discussed it at various parts in her diary, and this was why I choose the diary to become one used in the case study of the different apartment buildings, actually.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to continue to kind of jump around and the questions because Daria Stola also asked 2 questions, but the second of them follows up so well on the comments you just made that I'll just pose that now. So he asked, for your case study of Vienna, could you please offer more of your interpretation of the accounts from the post-1938 period? So was the unexpected animosity of neighbors and childhood friends described perhaps in other sources as particularly painful and remembered? You know, how was it remembered? Do you have other
yes.
Elaborate on that theme?
Actually, many memoirs which we have for the 1920s, 30s Vienna, from Vienna today as came to be about as part of the so-called Austrian Heritage collection, which was launched by Albert Lichtblau and the Leo Baeck Institute in New York. And therefore, in a lot of memoirs, actually, exactly this is what is addressed by people from whom most were children at this time, actually, and experienced how friends ended up having contact with them or insulted them or, just attacked them or something like. So this is a common line which you have in a lot of memoirs, actually. In some not, and in others even more so. So, yes.
Okay. All right, thank you. All right, so I'm now going to return to the first part of Scott Uri's question, which is directed to all of us, I take it. It says for the panelists and the chair, okay, to what extent are the population figures, community size, and language, Yiddish, relevant in the construction of urban neighborhoods and life? So 2 other factors to consider, the demography of these communities, and also the role of language. Presumably, many of the great majority of the new immigrants were Yiddish speakers, right? So would either of you like to comment on those, the role of those factors in the construction of these neighborhoods?
I can start, if that's okay with you, Susanne. I cannot look at language, unfortunately, because the sources I use, membership lists, taxation lists, and so on, basically don't mention what kind of language they spoke. So that is, in terms of this kind of topographical distribution of residences that I look at, it is basically just impossible, which is unfortunate. In terms of population figures and community size, I think this is really interesting, especially, well, of course, I think, especially in terms of Stockholm, because we do have a very, well, comparably to Vienna, for example, we have quite a small Jewish community, right? At this time, I'm talking about from the beginning of the 20th century up until 1935, there were between, the numbers rose from 2,000 to 5,000. So it's a really small group, which might perhaps explain why they actually don't live together or in clusters or in Jewish districts. We'd never have such a thing as a Jewish district, like the imagination or the idea of Leopoldstadt in Vienna, for example. So, and I think that really plays into that I guess it was difficult to create that sense of community feeling on the streets, in these public areas, which meant that it was basically more important to find a residence that was affiliated to your social status or economic standing, rather than finding a home closer to someone who you would know, because it wouldn't matter perhaps that much. Having said that, though, people who came from Eastern Europe, 2/3 of them did settle first on the southern island. So there's definitely a sense of sort of chain migration and starting off in this area, but then moving away as soon as you get more money.
Okay.
Should I continue, or do you want to?
Yeah, please.
So for Vienna, we have a lot of figures because the statistics on population, took out all these informations actually, and it doesn't seem that Yiddish as much was relevant for the construction of neighborhoods actually. Yet it is hard to say if, for example, congregations or prayer rooms were, because in different parts of the cities, you find prayer rooms, and you can't really get out of the statistical figures if people would tend to go to or prefer to go to the Leopoldstädter Temple, for example, despite the other ones. So in some cases, you find out if you have more textual sources also to be able to include, in others not. You would really, so this is also why I use a microhistorical approach, because if you don't look at a very small case in very close detail, you don't get out such information actually. And for the apartment buildings and the residents of the buildings I've examined so far, I can't say that this was really a pull factor, if you wish to call it like that. It is more likely, especially since there were so few small apartments to rent actually in Vienna at the time. So the Soziale Wohnbau was just about to begin, and so on and so forth. And everyone complained that the Wohnungselend, so there were very few apartments only in small size to rent. This was why such a lot of people had to rent beds. So it was more the necessity to find a place than looking on something else, as far as I have examined so far.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, and I'll just add here, since the question referred specifically to the question of language, of Yiddish language use, it would be interesting, I think, to look at, for example, if there were, I don't know if there were any Yiddish publications being published in Stockholm, but to see if there were, to see what shops, where there were advertisements, let's say for shops in particular neighborhoods, or, in the case of Leopoldstadt, if there were photographs that showed whether there were any kind of evidence of Yiddish being displayed on posters or shop signs, or, newsstands that sold Yiddish publications, given the mixed nature of the neighborhood, and particularly the theme you raised of, by the late 1930s, right, the question of rising anti-Semitism, to what extent Jewish Yiddish-speaking residents might have felt, we can't reconstruct whether they were speaking Yiddish in the street. I mean, we might be able to find evidence of that in memoirs or something, but to what extent they felt comfortable kind of signaling their presence through the public display of texts in Yiddish on signage or in advertisements or something like that, that just as a possible avenue of research. Okay, so now I'll come back to Dr. Stola's first question, which also regards Stockholm. He asked, do you see any trends in time, over time, such as growing concentration in some neighborhoods or dispersion across the city? So are there any, kind of trends over the period that you looked at that you could talk about?
Again, this is really interesting in the case of Stockholm, that, I mean, other people have done sort of topographical analysis of where Jewish people lived in Stockholm at the end of the 18th century, which would be the beginning of when Jews were allowed to live in Sweden and in Stockholm specifically, where we see that we don't really have a quarter or a Jewish quarter or a Jewish district, really. They don't cluster around the synagogue in any way. But as the city grows, specifically into the time period that I'm looking at, from the end of the 19th century up to the beginning of the 20th century, as the city grows, the Jewish population just basically moves with it. I have not found any specific clusters in terms of the whole Jewish population, or indeed, as we looked, and we don't have clusters among the Orthodox communities, Adas Yisrael's members either. At least I wouldn't call 5 people living on the same street as a cluster. That is not my idea, at least, of what clustering is, and that's the only thing that I have found. So instead of concentrations in specific neighborhoods, the Stockholm populations, Stockholm's Jewish population seems to have been really, well, as I said in my paper, being very in tune with what's happening in the city and moving with it to newly developed areas, or to the Southern Island if you were a newcomer from Eastern Europe. And as the city grew, people moved with it, basically, which I find really interesting. And that's why I think topographical integration is really important to talk about.
So thank you. So I don't see any other questions in the chat. I'll make a last call if people have other comments or questions they'd like to pose, since we unfortunately didn't have our third speaker here. We had a little more relaxed time frame, but we could also end a little early. I know it's a packed program, and I'm sure some people would appreciate an extra few minutes to stretch, let's say. So I'd like to thank both of you, Dr. Korbel and Dr. Hultman, for these 2 really thought-provoking papers, which fit so well together and open up, I think, new ways of thinking about these kind of long-standing tropes about immigration and Jewish neighborhoods. And there's several comments in the chat just thanking you for the papers and commenting on how thought-provoking they were. So to thank everyone out there in the that I can't see for attending this panel. And I know that you all thank me in joining our two speakers, Susanna Korbel and Maya Hultman, and that we look forward to hearing and reading more of their work in the future. So I think I'll wrap it up now with my thanks to everybody for their participation.